Amy. I take great privilege in introducing Judy Clements OBE. I have the privilege of working quite closely with her, and she has definitely become somewhat of a mentor for me in navigating the public sector. Judy spent a lot of her career working in the public sector and serving in that area. And one of the key areas that she served in and has worked closely with is the Home Office. So we're going to pick up from there, and you're going to just give me some insight, kind of following on from what Troy and Dr. Gifford Ramey were talking about, to just understand why we're where we are now. But before we get to where we are right now, let's look at the work you did surrounding Stephen Lawrence. And can you just set the scene for those who are maybe unfamiliar with the Stephen Lawrence case?
Okay, for those of who may not remember the Stephen Lawrence case, I think it was a most appalling, tragic murder of an 18-year-old young black man in southeast London, in Eltham. In 1993, he was on his way home with his friend Dwayne Brooks, waiting for the bus, and then decided to step out into the road to see if the bus was coming. And I think Dwayne had called out to him, "Is it coming?" And some white racist thugs heard the voice and actually approached Stephen and stabbed him several times. And he was fatally wounded pretty much at the scene. And I think that murder defined the way, although it took 5 years before we got a public inquiry. I have to say the Conservative government at the time, when Theresa May was actually chairman of the Conservative Party, they declined to do anything about it. And I was there when Jack told Doreen Lawrence that if they got into power in 97, the first thing he would do is call a public inquiry into Stephen's death.
Yeah.
He was finishing off his A-levels, wanted to be an architect, and his mother set up subsequently a charity into doing that. Very, very painful. I was privileged to be part of the Home Secretary's steering group and saw through probably 5 Home Secretaries over 7 years, beginning to the end, of overseeing all of the 70 recommendations that were by Sir William, I think he's Lord Macpherson now, into how the whole face of policing should change. But it didn't just focus on policing and the failures, because it was bad enough, that tragic murder, but there were 2 major internal police inquiries which failed to prosecute the individual.
Right.
Private prosecution that fell. It was just heart-wrenching that it took such a long time. There are allegations of corruption between the suspects' family members and the police arrangements, panorama. There were numerous documentaries on how this was done. But the first thing they had to look at was the way in which the police tackled racist crimes, and the Macpherson report defined the approach to that. But that didn't mean the police in isolation. There were implications for the Crown Prosecution Service. What was the interesting thing, I attended all the meetings with the steering group, but the one in particular where the DPP at the time, David Calvert-Smith, Lord David Calvert-Smith, High Court judge, was actually brought into the room under severe tension of being told that the CPS had to change with the way in which they communicated and interacted with victims and witnesses. They would just take the case from the police and prosecute it. They wouldn't communicate with the victims. So there were major changes in terms of how the Crown prosecution and the police interacted with victims and witnesses, and also the way the police liaison system worked. When I went subsequently to work at the Police Complaints Commission, I was the lead director for family liaison, because our role there was very different. Family liaison individuals in the police service are normally there to gather more information about a crime in a almost subtle way. Our role at the Police Complaints Commission was very different. It was to support and give information to the family. And if
Right.
there was anything suspicious, you'd pass that on. It also, the Macpherson report, Stephen Lawrence report, had implications for education because it compelled the education departments, local authorities to look at training for students in racial inequality and diversity. That was very important too. And one of the things that, particularly linking from what Professor Ramey had to say, is just remind ourselves of something that came out of the Lawrence report, which was the definition of racism or of racism and what it was all about. And the phrase institutional racism also
very iconic.
Racism came out of that. And I think that's very prevalent today, which is why we have all these studies and all these reports, and we haven't really moved that further forward. Again, largely because of some of the myths around the psyche and how Black people are perceived, particularly if we want to wear our hair natural or go in a certain way. When Professor Ramey was speaking of, there was a young lady on X Factor some years ago. I can't remember if she won or was a runner-up, but I remember reading her saying that she was told that if she wore her hair natural, she was unlikely to sell as many records. And I think there was a more recent winner that through COVID was actually talking about racism since the Black Lives Matter. But let us remind ourselves what that definition was, because I think it's very pertinent to everything that's happening around us.
Definitely.
Institutional racism was defined, and there was a time when I knew this off by heart, the collective failure of an organization to provide an appropriate and professional service to people because of the color of their skin, their culture, or their ethnic origin. And it goes on to say that it can be seen or detected in processes, attitudes, and behavior that amount to discrimination through prejudice, ignorance, thoughtlessness, and racist stereotyping, which disadvantages minority ethnic people. And in terms of the criminal justice system, that's what we see. So when I moved from the Midlands, it was to work as the special advisor to the prison service on race and diversity. And then I moved to the Police Complaints Commission. I was headhunted to go there. And I just wanted to just mention three cases that stood out for me in terms of when we think of George Floyd and all of what's happening now. The first one was Sean Rigg, who died in Brixton Police Station. Cardiac. He had a cardiac arrest. What I remember sickening me at the time, having been employed at the Police Complaints Commission, was that we could find that there was no impropriety by the police service. And I found that extremely frustrating because he clearly had mental health issues. So having founded that, it meant that a lot of organizations like Inquest, for example, and other civil rights movements took up the cause, because often at the Police Complaints Commission at that time, we were known as the toothless tiger. So you would get lots of police shootings, deaths in custody, and police officers were not at all prosecuted in any way. The other one was shooting Azelle Rodney. I remember this very well, where they pumped 6 bullets into Azelle Rodney, who was in the car. He was traveling with 2 other men. And they had observed, the intelligence said that they had been observed picking up some weapons from somewhere. But we did find that was an unlawful killing. Again, it took a number of years to get these conclusions. But then we're at the mercy of our wonderful or not, criminal justice system within the courts, because the courts actually acquitted the police officer. So it's very, very difficult. And then the other one, which I took the lead on, was the death of a black paratrooper, and those who are old enough may remember Panorama doing a documentary. This was very painful. It was a black paratrooper, so he had fought for Queen and country. He had had quite a lot to drink, and I think he was in an altercation with, it's not clear whether it was who he was in an altercation with, but he was black and he fell and had severe head injury. Now, this is where you've got criminal justice failures and the health service failures. So he was taken eventually in the early hours of the morning to Leeds Royal Infirmary, where, as those of you who have any idea about health, sometimes when one gets a head injury, you can react in a way that could make others around you feel uncomfortable. And he was kept waiting at the hospital. He was denied an X-ray. The nurse, when he arrived, they didn't take proper notes. The ambulance service didn't do a proper handover to the nurses in aid. So there was the doctor didn't have a track record. Next thing, because he was making loud noises, they called the police and he was thrown into the back of a police van. It is not known what happened, except that he was thrown out of the van into the police station, into the main custody area, where within 10 or 15 minutes he was dead. Before he died, and Panorama showed this, he was actually, I don't know if any of you have been near to someone who is dying and taking their last breaths, which is it's quite, and this is what he was actually doing. They ignored him. They were making monkey chants whilst Christopher Older was dying. And that, again, it just took years and years. And what we did was a joint report with what was then the Health Service Commission. They investigated complaints against the Health Service and made serious findings in respect of that. And then I come back to the family liaison aspect about, you know, just about, you know, the shootings, the next, but it's all the other follow-up in the way people are treated beyond the way relatives are treated. Because for family liaison, I remember this very well. I was responsible for keeping Christopher's sister up to date with information. And I remember she would keep me on the phone for hours. But one of the most profound things she said to me was after his funeral, Christopher's funeral, the police rang her up and said, well, by the way, you know, we've still got his brain and some other part. What it was in reality. But this is how people were treated. That's what she said. They had done a biopsy, and I don't know why they felt there was a need to say that to her, either, you know, or not convey that, you know, correctly. But this is the kind of, when we talk about the indifference, the ignorance, the thoughtfulness in the way people of colour have been treated at the hands of the criminal justice system. This is some of my first-hand experience. Has much changed? Well, we tried to implement changes. So, for example, where there was a death in custody, and it, regardless of ethnicity, the first thing we said is to make sure that the family are in touch with certain organisations where they can get their own pathologist. Because often, again, with certain cases, again, Christopher Older, I think they were no less than 4, and I could be wrong, they could have been more, post-mortems on this for different reasons, different stages of the inquiry. So you can imagine what the family is going. So what we said, one of the things is families must get, and there are agencies they can go to help them, so that their pathologist could be standing side by side with the Home Office pathologist. So there is one single post-mortem, one where there's a representative from the family, and then, of course, for the state, because all these are under Article 2 of the Human Rights Act.
Human Rights Act, yeah. There's so much in there.
Yes.
There is. At the start of our live, we had some statistics on the screen. One of them was that 3 Black individuals are 3 times more likely to be detained under the Mental Health Act. Another one was Black students are 3 times more likely to be excluded permanently from school. And another one was talking about the statistics around police, and about in 2018, 1.2% are Black. Now, for me, there's a failing ultimately with the system.
Yes. Yes.
And we're going to look at that a little bit more when Dr. Amy comes back in with Troy. But why do you change take so long? Because one of the things that you mentioned in terms of the reviews for each of these individuals is that the process just took too long. Why do you think that is? And do you think that particularly because it matters to do with race?
No,
Okay.
but I can see why. And the reason I say that was the drug that caused malformations in pregnancy, the big case that was in the news earlier this week, Pamador, I can't remember, took 42 years. 1978, they started protesting. And again, report after report, things being redacted and covered up until finally there was the full independent report, which the MP stood up waving, that actually said this drug should have been removed from the market 3-4 decades ago, and that the family should be compensated. Sometimes it's about resources. Sometimes it's about the complexity of the investigation, which may not start sometimes for a year or 2 years afterwards, and trying to retrieve information, because all of this needs to be evidence-based. So with the Christopher Alder case, for example, the paratrooper, one of the challenges for us at the Police Complaints Commission was that so many of the officers had retired, and you can't touch them after that. But yet somebody had lost their life, and not to mention the cover-ups that happen. And so information is not often readily available, and sometimes you have to subpoena information and find the right people to talk to. So timeliness is a big issue when the Complaints Commission was set up. And I was going to say that was the recommendation 58 of the McPherson report, because it was the first independent police complaints institution of its kind in the world, because we used to have people visiting because the precursor to that was the Police Complaints Authority. So although they had independent commissioners, the police force investigated themselves.
It was all internal.
The complaints that came to us, they still do, but it is a lot better.
Another thing I wanted to kind of touch on, I think a big difference between here in the UK and abroad is oftentimes those who are who have these tragic interactions with the police are not just bystanders. They're not just going about their daily interactions. For example, Mark Duggan, he was being followed by the police. What's the real difference, or what's at the heart of that, between the difference between our policing issue over here and the US?
Well, you give me our British policing any day. I still think, despite the challenges, we are by far the best in the world, and we have the systems. They don't always go right, and it looks to me as though there is a need for a further review. Fortunately, there haven't been too many shootings that I can recall now, but even the previous ones, we had the scrutiny of them. But I have to say, and I've also, my first 12 years of working life, 11 years, was as a police officer in a very large force in the Midlands. But the shootings, particularly for the Met, are usually as a result of pre-planned operations with intelligence that's been gathered. So they're used to going to that. What transpires when they apprehend a suspect is often questionable, because they will say, I feared for my life. And that, a number of cases, I have to say, would be justified. But then it's following through the process. Was everything done appropriately? What happens with the adrenaline Mark Duggan was a particularly difficult one, which was after my time. But the Azelle Rodney one, where use of excessive bullets was, I think, a big challenge. We have a more regulated system, oversight body here. What I would like, because I seem to have lost track of whether there are, and perhaps as Adventists we could have a forum that regularly dialogues once a quarter with the police the mayor's office,
commissioners, and
yes, to look into that, because when I was actually involved in this work, there were lots of conversations and meaningful conversations. So I chaired the Trust and Confidence working group, which was a subgroup of the Lawrence Steering Group, and I was a member of the search, and that was all about rebuilding confidence between the Black community, which is really tough, and the police, because of the total distrust. And it seems that we're back there again. We've got, look, one of our most celebrated athletes, Bianca Williams, and her partner, Ricardo DeSantos, and their 3-month-old baby. It seems as though we've gone backwards when I looked at that, and the lack of sensitivity. And again, I thought it was very interesting, the statements they made to say they were driving round on the wrong side of the road, etc. We know that that's, being black whilst driving, incidentally, a black, very expensive Merc, and making the racial stereotyping. But what I was relieved to see was that they apologized. And of course, it's out of the news now, and heaven forbid for the next one. But something similar happened in Bristol a couple of weeks before, in the middle of the Black Lives Matter campaign, where a couple were just going back home and they'd left their car, a BMW, and they approached them at their front door, and they were so discourteous. But it's good when you've got sensible leaders that say, let's kill this. You apologize and you move on, because at the end of the day, the police still rely on us for information in their work, whatever the color or shade of communities. And I'd like to see us rebuild trust, perhaps because law enforcement is always going to be in my DNA and kind of locking up the bad guys. But they do get it wrong quite often. In America, I just feel that there's a tendency to be a bit too trigger happy, because we've had George Floyd, but we've had a number of deaths since, within a week of it, where they just, painful. I mustn't get emotional. Professor Gifford was really emotional and passionate. but it's so easy to do so because we're just human.